The moment you stop needing approval, your behavior becomes unpredictable. Most people are taught that being liked is a virtue. They are praised for being agreeable, rewarded for accommodating others, and encouraged to smooth tension whenever it appears. From the outside, this looks like emotional intelligence. Psychologically, it is something else entirely. Wanting to be liked is not kindness. It is a survival strategy. It forms early before logic develops. Approval once meant safety. Rejection meant risk. So, the nervous system learned to associate harmony with protection and disagreement with danger. That conditioning doesn't disappear in adulthood. It becomes more sophisticated. Adults who want to be liked don't beg for approval. They negotiate for it quietly. They soften opinions before challenge appears. They explain decisions before anyone questions them. They justify boundaries to avoid discomfort. They tolerate subtle disrespect to preserve emotional balance. They call it maturity, but what's actually happening is emotional dependence. Their behavior is shaped not by clarity or principle, but by anticipation of reaction. And this is where power begins to leak. Approval seeking doesn't look like weakness. It looks responsive. People who want to be liked move quickly, fill silence, reassure preemptively, react emotionally to pressure, and try to stabilize interactions instead of holding position. The nervous system reads this instantly. People may not think this person needs approval, but they feel something else. This person is adjustable. Adjustable people invite influence. Here is the first uncomfortable truth. Wanting to be liked is not neutral. It shapes decisions before logic intervenes. When approval matters, choices are filtered through imagined emotional consequences. Will this upset them? Will this make me look cold? Will this damage the connection? By the time the decision is made, it is already compromised. This is why approval seekers often feel disconnected from their own actions. They know what they meant to say, but softened it. They knew where the boundary was, but moved it. Not because they lack intelligence, but because the nervous system chose emotional safety over clarity. This is conditioning, and conditioning creates predictability. Predictability is where control enters. People who want to be liked are easier to read because they are easier to pressure. They respond to tone shifts, react to disappointment, hurry under implied urgency, and explain when confusion is suggested. This makes them valuable, but not respected. Respect forms around stability, not emotional availability. Likability feels safe because it reduces immediate friction, but over time, it erodes authority. Authority requires something approval-seeking cannot tolerate: being misunderstood. Strong positions create silence and tension before acceptance. Approval seekers rush to resolve that tension, and in doing so, they give others the upper position. They explain, they justify, they negotiate. And the moment the explanation becomes emotional, hierarchy shifts. The other person becomes the evaluator. Your words become evidence. Your tone becomes data. You are no longer stating a decision. You are defending one. And once you are defending, you are no longer leading. This is why approval seeking attracts subtle disrespect, not aggression, testing, interruptions, boundary pushes framed as jokes, repeated why questions. Not because people are cruel, but because the nervous system senses flexibility. Manipulators understand this instinctively. They don't attack likable people. They engage them. They provoke explanations, not to understand, but to destabilize. Each explanation gives leverage. Each emotional clarification hands over control. Here is the deeper exposure. People who want to be liked believe they are choosing harmony. In reality, they are choosing predictability. and predictability is the opposite of power. Power emerges when behavior is no longer governed by emotional reaction, when silence doesn't create anxiety, when misunderstanding is tolerated without collapse. This doesn't require hostility or coldness. It requires removing approval as a governing force. And when approval stops being currency, behavior changes immediately. The pace slows, reactions sharpen, silence gains weight, decisions stop bending under pressure. People hesitate. They regulate themselves instead of regulating you. Not because you demanded respect, but because emotional leverage disappeared. This is the trap of wanting to be liked. It feels harmless. It feels mature. But psychologically, it keeps you adjustable. And adjustable people are never in control. Before we go deeper into why approval makes behavior predictable, tap like and hit subscribe. Because what comes next reveals how the need to be liked quietly hands control to others. And why power begins. The moment that needs to dissolve. Approval seeking does not simply affect how you feel about yourself. It rewires how others position themselves around you. The moment someone senses that being liked matters to you, hierarchy begins to shift. This does not happen consciously. No one thinks, this person needs approval, therefore I can dominate them. It happens at a nervous system level. Humans are constantly scanning for stability, and approval seeking registers as emotional dependence, even when it's subtle. Dependence invites testing. Testing is not aggression, it is diagnostic. People test to see how much resistance exists, how firm boundaries are, and how much emotional pressure is required to create movement. When someone wants to be liked, the tests are small at first. A slightly dismissive tone, a delayed reply, a boundary crossed as a joke, a repeated question framed as curiosity, and then they watch. If you adjust, they learn. Approval seekers adjust reflexively. They explain themselves to restore comfort. They soften statements to reduce friction. They reassure preemptively to avoid being misunderstood. They reveal emotional reasoning to prove good intent. None of this looks like weakness in isolation. In fact, it often looks socially skilled. But psychologically, every adjustment signals flexibility, and flexibility invites further pressure. This is how power dynamics erode without confrontation. Hierarchy is not built on force. It is built on who holds position when tension appears. Approval seekers resolve tension outward. Strong individuals allow tension to exist without collapsing it. That difference alone determines who is leading and who is negotiating. Here is the first consequence of approval seeking. Authority becomes conditional. When your authority depends on emotional agreement, it must be maintained continuously. You can never fully rest in your position because you are always monitoring reactions. Did that upset them? Did that come across wrong? Should I clarify? Should I soften? The mind stays externally oriented. Decisions are no longer guided by principle alone, but by anticipated response. This is exhausting and visible. People sense when someone is emotionally managing the room. They may appreciate it, but they do not defer to it. Deference forms around self-command, not emotional accommodation. The person who stabilizes themselves under pressure is perceived as higher status than the person who stabilizes others. Approval seekers reverse this dynamic. They regulate other people's emotions to maintain harmony. They step in quickly when discomfort appears. They explain to ease tension. They apologize for smooth transitions. And in doing so, they signal something critical. I am responsible for how you feel. Once that signal is sent, hierarchy shifts. The other person is no longer required to self-regulate. They can push, probe, and escalate, knowing you will manage the emotional fallout. This is why approval seekers experience more boundary testing over time. Not because they invite disrespect intentionally, but because their behavior removes consequences. This is also why manipulators are drawn to likable people. Manipulators do not look for conflict. They look for access. Emotional access is the gateway to influence. Approval seekers offer it freely. They respond quickly. They explain emotionally. They feel compelled to resolve discomfort. They fear being misinterpreted. This creates a predictable loop. Pressure produces explanation. Explanation produces information. Information produces leverage. Manipulators don't argue. They question. They ask why repeatedly. They express confusion. They imply disappointment. They slow the conversation while you speed it up. And with every emotional explanation, the dynamic flips further. You are now working to be understood. They are deciding whether your reasons are sufficient. This is the judge position. The moment someone occupies the judge position, authority begins to dissolve. Judges interrupt. Judges reframe. Judges feel entitled to evaluate your tone, timing, and intention. And the approval seeker, sensing this shift, often responds by explaining more, trying to regain balance without realizing they are accelerating the loss of it. This is the second consequence of approval seeking. Explanation replaces assertion. Strong positions do not require defense, but approval seekers defend preemptively. They explain decisions before they are questioned. They justify boundaries instead of stating them. They narrate internal conflict to appear reasonable. This turns every action into a discussion. And once an action becomes a discussion, it becomes negotiable. Negotiable authority is not authority. It is permission that must be renewed. This is why approval seekers often feel that people don't take them seriously, even when they are competent. Competence does not establish hierarchy. Emotional containment does. People trust what stands on its own. They question what needs constant clarification. This is not about coldness or emotional distance. It is about emotional discipline. Strong individuals do not withhold emotion because they lack it. They withhold it because they understand timing and leverage. They know that emotional transparency under pressure invites negotiation. Approval seekers do the opposite. They disclose emotion to restore comfort. They explain uncertainty to appear honest. They soften limits to avoid appearing rigid. And in doing so, they teach others exactly how to move them. This leads to the third consequence: predictability. Approval seekers are predictable under pressure. They respond quickly. They feel silence. They react to disappointment. They escalate explanations when questioned. Predictability makes people comfortable, but it also makes them controllable. When someone knows how you respond emotionally, they know how to influence outcomes. This is why approval seekers often feel subtly managed, not dominated, managed. Conversations drift toward others' preferences. Decisions get reshaped through emotional cues. Boundaries erode through repetition. And the approval seeker adapts, believing they are being cooperative. But cooperation without self-command is submission, disguised as harmony. Hierarchy stabilizes around those who do not negotiate their position emotionally. When someone does not rush to explain, does not soften under pressure, does not react to disappointment, behavior around them changes. People slow down. They choose words more carefully. They hesitate before pushing. Not because they fear punishment, but because emotional leverage no longer works. This is the core principle of this scene. Those who need to be liked are forced to negotiate their authority in real time. Every interaction becomes a subtle exchange. Reassurance for compliance, explanation for acceptance, harmony for concession. And the negotiation never ends. Strong individuals end the negotiation, by removing approval as currency. They do not announce this. They do not confront it. They simply stop responding emotionally to pressure. They allow silence. They tolerate misunderstanding. They let others sit with uncertainty. And something shifts. Testing decreases. Questions become cleaner. Manipulative tactics lose traction. Not because the strong individual became aggressive, but because the emotional hooks stopped landing. When approval is no longer the goal, pressure loses direction. This is why people describe such individuals as hard to move, intimidating without trying, or grounded. What they are sensing is not dominance. It is emotional independence. And emotional independence collapses manipulative dynamics automatically. Approval seeking destroys power dynamics not because it is immoral, but because it reverses regulation. You manage others. They evaluate you. Authority drains outward. There is a precise moment when approval loses relevance. Not gradually, not philosophically, but internally, like a switch being flipped. Nothing external changes at first. Your tone doesn't harden. Your posture doesn't become aggressive. You don't announce boundaries or withdraw from people. But something critical stops operating. You no longer calculate how your actions will be received. That calculation is the source of most weakness. When approval matters, every decision passes through an emotional filter. How will this land? What will this cause? Will this create distance? When approval stops mattering, that filter disappears. Decisions move directly from judgment to action. No emotional detour, no negotiation with imagined reactions. This is where power returns. Internally, the first change is silence. Not external silence, mental silence. The constant background noise of anticipation shuts off. You stop rehearsing explanations. You stop preemptively defending intentions. You stop managing impressions in real time. And without that internal noise, your mind becomes slower, heavier, more deliberate. This slowness is often misunderstood. It's not hesitation. It's lack of urgency. Urgency is born from emotional dependence. When approval is no longer required, urgency collapses. You don't rush to respond. You don't feel pulled by disappointment. You don't feel pressure to clarify. And because you don't rush, your behavior becomes difficult to predict. This is where unpredictability begins, not as chaos, but as freedom. Most people confuse unpredictability with instability. They think unpredictable people are erratic, emotional, inconsistent. That's not the unpredictability that creates power. The dangerous form is different. It emerges when emotional triggers no longer dictate response. When someone disappoints you and you don't react. When someone pressures you and you don't accelerate. When someone questions you and you don't explain. When silence appears and you don't fill it. Your behavior stops following emotional scripts. Scripts are what people rely on to control outcomes. They expect a reaction. They expect reassurance. They expect engagement. When those expectations fail, the nervous system feels disoriented, not threatened, uncertain. And uncertainty reshapes hierarchy. If this is changing how you see likability, pressure, and influence, tap like and hit subscribe. Your support matters, because it helps this message reach people who are ready to stop adjusting for approval and start moving with emotional independence. The second internal shift is restraint. You don't say less because you're hiding. You say less because nothing needs to be defended. You don't withhold emotion because you're detached. You withhold it because expression is no longer required to stabilize yourself. This is emotional containment. Containment is not suppression. Suppression is avoidance. Containment is possession. You feel everything, but nothing leaks. And when emotion stops leaking, it stops being usable by others. This is where perception changes. People are wired to read emotional cues. Tone, speed, explanation, hesitation. These cues help them orient themselves. When those cues disappear, people lose their reference points. They can't tell if they are influencing you. They can't tell if pressure is working. They can't tell where they stand. So they adjust. This is the moment testing ends. Testing only works when feedback is available. When you no longer react emotionally, tests return nothing. No reassurance, no irritation, no acceleration, just presence. And without feedback, the nervous system pulls back. Pushing feels unsafe when nothing moves. People don't test what doesn't bend. This is why, after the shift, behavior around you changes without conversation. Interruptions decrease, jokes soften, questions become cleaner. Pressure slows. Not because you asserted dominance, but because emotional leverage disappeared. This is the third internal change. Orientation reverses. Before, you were oriented toward others. You tracked their reactions. You adjusted pacing. You managed the tone. Now, others orient toward you. They wait. They watch. They regulate themselves before speaking. Not consciously, instinctively. You become the fixed point. This does not make you cold. It makes you grounded. You're no longer floating in the emotional field of the room. You're anchored, and anchoring creates gravity. The most dangerous part of this shift is not how others see you. It's how you experience yourself. You stop feeling the need to be understood immediately. Misunderstanding becomes tolerable. Silence becomes neutral. Distance becomes informative instead of threatening. This is psychological freedom. Freedom is not doing whatever you want. Freedom is not being moved by what no longer matters. When approval loses power, your internal state stabilizes. You are no longer negotiating your right to act. You assume it. And assumption changes everything. You don't need to announce authority. You don't need to reinforce boundaries. You don't need to explain decisions emotionally. Your behavior carries weight because it is no longer reactive. This is why people describe the shift as dangerous. Not because it harms others, but because it removes their access. Emotional access is the gateway to influence. When that gateway closes, manipulation fails silently. Manipulators don't argue with you. They disengage. Testers don't escalate. They retreat. Pressure loses direction. And respect forms where resistance once lived. The key psychological principle of this scene is simple. Unpredictability is not chaos. It is freedom from emotional control. When reactions are no longer guaranteed, influence collapses. When influence collapses, hierarchy stabilizes around you. This is not an external performance. It's an identity rupture. You don't try to stop caring. Caring dissolves when self-command replaces dependence. You no longer seek alignment through approval. You assume alignment internally and let reality respond. And reality does respond. Respect does not come from effort. It comes from reaction. This is the paradox most people never see. The more you try to be respected, the more you signal uncertainty about your position. Trying introduces motion. Motion introduces adjustment. Adjustment introduces negotiation. And negotiation dissolves authority. Respect is not requested. It is registered. People don't decide to respect you because you're agreeable or warm. They respond to something more basic: stability. The nervous system trusts what doesn't flinch. It defers to what doesn't chase a reaction. When you stop trying, behavior around you changes without discussion. The first shift is calmness. When approval mattered, calmness was fragile. It depended on harmony. When harmony broke, Explanations rushed in. Now calmness becomes structural. You don't use it to keep peace. You use it because nothing inside needs calming. And calmness, when it's not performative, reads as authority. Calm people aren't impressive because they're relaxed. They're impressive because pressure doesn't move them. When others escalate, you slow. When urgency appears, you pause. When questions push, you answer minimally or not at all. This creates contrast, and contrast creates hierarchy. People begin to measure themselves around you. They choose words more carefully. They hesitate before interrupting. They regulate tone before pushing. Not because you demanded it, but because your emotional neutrality removed leverage. Likability once functioned as your social signal. It kept things smooth, but likability requires responsiveness. Responsiveness creates obligation, and obligation invites testing. Calmness replaces likability because it removes obligation entirely. You're no longer signaling, "I will adjust to keep this comfortable." You're signaling, "I am comfortable regardless." That signal is rare. When people don't know how to move you emotionally, they become cautious. Not fearful, attentive. They watch, they wait, they calibrate, they stop assuming access. Respect begins as restraint. This is the second shift. Restraint replaces engagement. You stop filling the silence. You stop softening edges. You stop explaining intent. And silence gains weight. Silence is misunderstood because most people use it to avoid. You use it to hold position. That difference is felt immediately. Silence that comes from fear leaks tension. Silence that comes from certainty creates gravity. Gravity pulls behavior inward. People talk less around you. They reveal more when they do. They check themselves mid-sentence. Not because you're intimidating, but because your presence doesn't invite performance. This is emotional neutrality at work. Neutrality is not coldness. Coldness repels. Neutrality stabilizes. It doesn't reward escalation or punish it. It simply doesn't move. And when nothing moves, pressure collapses back onto the source. People realize quickly that emotional tactics don't land. No reassurance arrives. No irritation appears. No acceleration happens. So behavior self-corrects. This is how hierarchy forms without confrontation. You are no longer enforcing boundaries. You are embodying them. And embodied boundaries don't require explanation. They exist whether others like them or not. The third shift is perception. People stop reading you emotionally and start reading you structurally. Instead of tracking mood, they track timing. Instead of probing reactions, they assess consequence. Instead of testing limits, they respect them. You become harder to read and easier to trust. Trust doesn't come from transparency. It comes from predictability of principle. When people know you won't bend under pressure, they stop applying it. When people know you won't explain under tension, they stop demanding it. Respect forms when emotional leverage disappears. This is the key psychological principle of this scene. Once leverage is gone, interaction simplifies. Conversations get cleaner. Requests become direct. Games fall away. Some people rise to the structure, others drift out. Neither requires effort from you. You are no longer negotiating space. You occupy it. The most surprising part is internal. You feel steadier. You speak less, but clearer. You don't wonder how things landed, because you're no longer tracking approval as feedback. This creates composure. Composure is not confidence. Confidence can be loud and brittle. Composure is quiet and durable. It doesn't spike. It doesn't collapse. It holds, and people respond to what holds. Trying to be respected keeps you moving. Stopping allows respect to arrive. At some point, The shift stops being a decision and becomes a condition. You no longer remind yourself not to seek approval. You simply don't feel the pull anymore. Wanting to be liked fades the way an old reflex fades, not through resistance, but through irrelevance. The identity lock clicks in quietly, and once it does, it doesn't unlock. This is where calm becomes permanent. Not performative calm, not the kind that breaks under pressure, the kind that exists before pressure arrives. Silence no longer feels awkward because it's no longer something you use to manage others. It's something you inhabit. You stop scanning faces for reaction. You stop tracking tone for approval. You stop adjusting yourself to keep emotional equilibrium in the room. Your equilibrium is internal now. This is the moment self-command replaces validation. Self-command means you don't need agreement to move forward. You don't need reassurance to stand by a decision. You don't need to be understood immediately to remain stable. Your actions are no longer negotiations. They are expressions of alignment. When you speak, it's because speaking strengthens position, not because silence feels uncomfortable. And because you don't leak emotion, people stop trying to access it. Approval seeking once made you readable. Readability made you manageable. Now, emotional access is limited, not because you hide, but because you don't broadcast. You feel everything, but you don't externalize it on demand. That containment changes the entire dynamic. Manipulation requires emotional cooperation. You no longer offer it. This is why manipulators disengage without drama. They sense there's nothing to work with, no urgency to exploit, no guilt to activate, no reassurance to extract. They try their usual pressure, questions, tone, repetition, and nothing accelerates. No explanation arrives. No emotional adjustment follows. The tactic dies where it stands. Influence collapses without conflict. This is what dangerous actually means in psychological terms. Not aggressive, not dominant. Dangerous because you are hard to move. Dangerous because your reactions are delayed, measured, or absent. Dangerous because you don't need outcomes to validate identity. You don't chase. You don't explain. You don't negotiate worth. Your silence is no longer defensive. It's structural. Structural silence holds space. It doesn't fill it. It allows others to reveal intent without interference. People talk themselves into exposure. They rush. They overstate. They justify. And you learn everything without asking. Silence becomes information. This is where psychological gravity stabilizes. Gravity isn't force, it's pull. People orient themselves around you because you don't orient around them. They wait for your response because your response is rare. They regulate themselves because you won't regulate for them. They respect boundaries because boundaries are implied, not argued. Your presence changes rooms without announcement. Conversations are slow. Interruptions decrease. Testing disappears. Not because you demanded respect, but because you stopped signaling availability for disrespect. The internal effect is subtle, but permanent. You no longer feel the need to correct misperception immediately. You allow time to clarify what words would weaken. You understand that misunderstanding is not a threat. Instability is. And because you are stable, you can afford delay. This is identity integration. You are calm under pressure because pressure doesn't threaten self-worth. You have minimal emotional leakage because emotion is contained, not suppressed. You carry high psychological gravity because nothing about you feels reactive or dependent. And you are impossible to manipulate through approval because approval is no longer currency. People sense this before they understand it. They adjust behavior instinctively. They choose restraint. They simplify interaction. Some drift away. Others rise to the structure. Both outcomes are correct. The final realization is quiet and absolute. You don't need to be liked to be effective. You don't need to be understood to be respected. You don't need to be validated to be aligned. And alignment is the source of authority. From here, nothing needs proving. You move slower. You speak less. You decide once. And the world responds. This is the lock. Once it clicks, wanting to be liked doesn't tempt you anymore. It feels unnecessary, like noise from a life you've already outgrown. If this protocol showed you why unpredictability comes from self-command, tap like and hit subscribe. And comment this below. Approval is not my currency. Because when the need to be liked disappears, reaction loses its grip, and power stabilizes naturally.